In Scripture, God speaks. Contextualization, therefore, begins with listening, well before we venture to speak or do anything. However, our efforts to contextualize flounder for a similar reason that our attempts to communicate fail. We make assumptions, and when we assume, we don't listen. What then are the implications for contextualization? To answer this question, this paper first considers briefly a few challenges that hinder the work of contextualization. Next, I explain why contextualization necessarily begins with interpretation and is not simply a task involving communication or application. In so doing, we will move beyond past debates about ethnohermeneutics. Finally, I will suggest a model for relating biblical and contemporary cultures that can equip us to utilize the inherent limitations of our worldview lenses for the sake of biblically faithful and culturally meaningful contextualization. The same question confronts any evangelical who wants to do contextualization. What is the relationship between the Bible and culture? Evangelicals affirm the authority of Scripture over culture. Yet, what does this practically mean for engaging culture? Under the name ethnohermeneutics, some scholars propose ways to address the tension between the Bible and culture. The views of Larry Caldwell probably cause more concern among evangelicals than other writers of the topic. He says, ethnohermeneutics is simply biblical interpretation done in multi-generational, multicultural, and cross-cultural contexts that, as far as possible, uses dynamic hermeneutical methods which already reside in the culture. Because God works, quote, through cognitive environments inherent in each culture, end quote, Caldwell suggests that missionaries use indigenous hermeneutical methods. Others have highlighted the weaknesses of Caldwell's model, which, as one author puts it, blurs the distinction between meaning and significance. His proposal veers toward reader response and eisegesis, not exegesis. Will Brooks counters that we should adopt a grammatical historical approach to interpreting the Bible. While correct, Brooks does not resolve the underlying tension between the Bible, culture, and contextualization. Evangelicals usually attempt to draw universal principles and truths from Scripture, then apply them to Scripture. This seemingly benign effort masks two problems. First, when contextualizing, evangelicals argue for the priority of Scripture over culture. While ostensibly self-evident, this claim might hinge on an order fallacy. The word priority can refer either to temporal sequence, what comes first, or to authoritative rank, what has authority. According to the fallacy, whatever comes first temporally has greater authority. Yet sequence is not always supreme. For example, in defending sola scriptura, apologists routinely appeal to reason first. Likewise, general revelation grounds and makes possible special revelation. It primes or readies the mind for what is to come. General revelation is like scaffolding. Special revelation is like bricks. Yet special revelation has ultimate authority. Accordingly, there is no reason to conclude that one must start with the Bible in the contextualization process. It is possible to begin with culture without compromising the authority of the Bible. There is a second problem with saying that contextualization is a process that follows biblical interpretation in which we merely apply or communicate biblical truth. In short, people assume the gospel. We can assume the gospel by assuming that Western theology is the primary way to teach doctrine. We then press non-Western people to conform their basic categories of thinking to those found in traditional Western culture. Likewise, When we assume the gospel, we prioritize certain cultural expressions of the gospel message as though they were equally prioritized by the biblical writers. Western culture and evangelical subcultures create a fixed framework for understanding the gospel. Even if Western theology is true and good, it remains a contextualization. Western theology is still contextualized theology. By assuming the primacy of Western theological categories, we undermine biblically faithful and culturally meaningful contextualization. We are left only with the possibility of contextualizing a contextualization. That is, trying to contextualize Western theology. We then share biblical truth, but in ways that lack meaning for non-Western cultures. Our method of contextualization should be both firm and flexible, reflect the dynamic relationship between the Bible and culture. While the gospel does not change, biblical writers clearly present the gospel in contrasting ways. So, where do we go from here? We start with a basic point that evangelicals increasingly acknowledge as true but remain perplexed about when it comes to applying it. David Clark says this succinctly, quote, all interpretation begins with the assumptions, values, beliefs, and experiences that a reader brings to the text. He adds, the idea that one can achieve an acultural theology is a fundamentalist fallacy. What does this suggest? Put it simply, contextualization begins with biblical interpretation. The contextualization process starts before we try to communicate or apply the gospel. We each interpret Scripture in one context rather than another. All interpretations use contextual vantage points. No one perspective voids other interpretations that use different worldview lenses. One's methodology should assist him to see the world as the Scripture interprets the world. When Christians read the Bible in other people's cultural language, that is, their categories of thought, they gain a new capacity to hear the meaning of Scripture. Contextualization, then, is both inevitable and essential. We need to intentionally consider culture's influence on our theology. This conception of contextualization reflects the basic instinct that spurred ethnohermeneutics while avoiding key weaknesses. As I define it, contextualization is the process wherein people interpret, communicate, and apply the Bible within a particular cultural context. Contextualization begins whenever we read the Bible from the perspective of a given context. Contextualization is not primarily something we do to the gospel. It is the mind's perception of and response to the gospel. An advantage of this perspective of contextualization is that it enables us to preserve a historical grammatical approach to biblical interpretation. It also takes seriously the influence of our cultural lens and the potential contribution of non-Western contexts. Furthermore, it corrects our tendency to conflate our theology with the Bible's meaning. While we hope our theology reflects the meaning of the biblical authors, humility demands we seek our limitations and blind spots. We are not omniscient. Our cultural lens limits what we see. It directs our attention to certain things and away from others. This is why we don't need to exchange a Western lens for an Indian or a Chinese lens. Rather, we should broaden our lens to include global perspectives. Conjoining these cultural lenses enables us to ask better questions, challenge cultural assumptions, and be more observant of both the text and the world. One writer explains, a cross-cultural reading is more objective than a monocultural reading of the biblical text. If our cultural limits our ability to understand biblical text, then our capacity to grasp the culture of the ancient biblical authors is even more limited. After all, we are separated by over 2,000 years. All biblical interpreters face this exact same challenge. How do we address these two obstacles? That is, the limits of a monocultural perspective and our limited access to ancient biblical worldviews. I'll suggest a model that helps us use contemporary cultures to better approximate the perspective of ancient biblical writers. Contemporary cultures help us interpret ancient biblical texts. Although no contemporary culture is identical to the ancient biblical cultures, there are certainly differing degrees of overlap. In some respect, East Asian cultures today resemble the ancient Near East better than those of Chicago or an LA suburb. In other cases, one may hear the echoes of Scripture most clearly when reading from a traditional African perspective. Those same themes are less pronounced to someone in London or Paris. Inasmuch as similarities exist between modern and ancient cultures, contemporary readers from around the globe have advantages and disadvantages when interpreting the Bible. These advantages are not absolute, but relative to the topic and theme. Human cultures complement one another. This diagram illustrates a step of interpretation whereby one can better grasp the biblical context by reaching across the world's contemporary cultures. The world's cultural history is mapped as a globe here. We can think in two directions. The Earth's surface represents modern-day societies. The earliest human communities are located at the Earth's core. Moving from the center through the Earth's crust, we see the evolution and interweaving of human cultures. No neatly defined lines demarcate one culture from another across successive periods. Yet, one can still speak in broad categories, trends, and characteristics. There is both continuity and discontinuity. Younger civilizations near to the Earth's core in the diagram come from cultures before them. Otherwise said, contemporary cultures are amalgamations. They fuse together cultures from history in ways that are incomprehensible. Vast differences aside, younger societies share aspects in common with ancient civilizations. Therefore, China can be described as an honor culture, not a law-guilt-based culture. Even though law-related concepts like judges and politics and order and whatnot exist in China. In some respect, the world's early cultures typify what is most basic to human culture. Succeeding generations are simply creative adaptations and expressions of essential human community. This is not surprising since every culture distinctly manifests the same image of God. Contemporary cultures are represented here as trees, living, varied, and rooted in the ground of history. Some have shallow roots, others go deeper. They all spring from the earth below, from which they get nutrients. In the picture, roots represent how modern cultures emerge from previous civilizations. The process is natural but complex, mysterious but reasonably comprehensible. People can understand a culture's influences by digging into its past. It's easy to understand how the civil rights movement influenced 21st century America. It's harder to see how 6th century Egyptian culture weaved its way through medieval Europe to eventually shape present-day American culture. Still, as people do research, they find increased interaction among the mother civilizations to the modern world. For example, the Silk Road famously spanned Asia. As a result, countless cultural exchanges no doubt spawned new communities and ideas that still impact us today. Simply put, present-day cultures, at some level, share common ancient histories. Inasmuch as the world's people share common backgrounds, various themes will reappear again and again in cultures both across time and geography. For example, ancient cultures are often depicted as being collectivist and honor-shame oriented. Such descriptions do not deny that ancient cultures also had individualistic or law-oriented aspects. Not surprisingly, wherever one looks in history or around the world, humans are still concerned with group identity, reputation, and the like. Learning about contemporary cultures equips us to better interpret Scripture. Yet, this does not mean that culture provides authoritative revelation. All things being equal, a multicultural approach is advantageous for seeing things in the Bible that are actually in the text. Much is missed with a monocultural view. Therefore, when it comes to interpreting the Bible, there should be a less clear distinction between missiology and theology. Missionaries should be among the world's finest theologians. Likewise, theologians would be helped by visiting or living in modern-day Middle East or the Far East. Westerners who travel to China can quickly realize the importance of collective identity, faith, and hierarchy to the Chinese people. Such priorities echo those of ancient biblical cultures. As one better understands these values and the internal logic of such worldviews, Christians will have eyes to see, so to speak, those key themes and motifs within passages that previously seemed so familiar. Suddenly, their new appreciation for how people think around the world become tools to digging deeper into the biblical author's original meaning. Certain objections serve as warnings to be addressed. First, we should not equate any modern culture with ancient biblical cultures. Chinese culture differs from those of Abraham, David, Jesus, or Paul. The point being made is that these cultures have overlapping themes of emphasis or creation structures. Even if particular details differ between them, readers are at least aware these values and thought categories are relevant. A second concern is eisegesis, whereby the reader's own assumptions force an interpretation onto the text. Frankly, this is a danger for every interpreter, even more so for people with a monocultural perspective. In fact, a multicultural perspective actually helps to minimize eisegesis because one is aware of a broader range of issues that have concerned humans in history. Finally, a third concern is relativism. Does this model collapse into relativism or break down the Bible's authority? Not at all. Interpreters should always seek the meaning of the text as intended by the biblical writers in their context. All biblical interpretations are bound by this common locus. Reconsider the proverbial blind men who touch different parts of the elephant. Leslie Newbegin notes that the word picture is self-defeating because the narrator, rather than proving relativism, actually presumes an absolute perspective and a common object of study. There are only so many parts of the elephant that can be touched. If the blind men talk with each other, they will get a sound understanding of what they're all touching. Everyone has blind spots, yet collaboration opens our eyes to see more than would be possible alone. I will briefly highlight a few implications. First, this model makes a case for prioritizing the work of long-term missionaries. Short-term work does not afford the kind of reflection and internalization needed to grasp the way locals see the world. In fact, brief exposures to another culture can easily enforce pride in one's own culture, fueling prejudice or narrow-mindedness. An overemphasis on short-term missions must not become a detriment of long-term funding, training, and placement. It is the long-term worker who typically has deeper relationships with locals. Thus, they have the greater opportunity to develop contextualized theologies. Second, we should encourage and develop global theologies, not being content with only Western or traditional theological formulations. Doing this requires tremendous humility, cooperation, intentional training, and a shift in priorities. Third, any particular cultural perspective by itself is insufficient to holistically interpret Scripture. Fourth, we need to purposely use other cultural perspectives to interpret Scripture. Fifth, the model illustrates the importance of the doctrine of humanity and of general revelation. Sixth, second culture people, including second generation children, could potentially be key people to assist the contextualization process. Seventh, humans are more alike than some might think. This observation should both humble and comfort us, making us more open to the insights of others around the world. Let me conclude by saying, it is not enough to say that the Bible and culture are both important. Our understanding of contextualization must recognize the complex dynamics at play, beginning with interpreting the message of the biblical writers. God has spoken through ancient cultures to people who live in countless diverse contexts spanning centuries and continents. While some advocates of ethnohermeneutics seek to inject humility into our process of biblical interpretation, they mistakenly cast aside a historical grammatical approach as though it were merely Western. A historical grammatical method of interpretation helps us to respect the cultural context of the biblical writers. This paper offers a way to overcome various obstacles to contextualization, which begins with interpretation. By discerning the relationship between the Bible and culture, we gain insight for doing contextualization in a way that is both biblically faithful and culturally meaningful.